Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Audit and Governance Committee. Just to remind ourselves, this meeting is recorded and it is open to the public. On the mechanics, if we can keep mute when we're not talking, and then the difficult bit is always to remember to put the talking on afterwards. And I will use put your hands up if you'd like to speak. And if I make a mistake on that, I'm sure somebody will nudge me if I missed a hand. Okay, so if we move on then to item 1, we've got apologies from Councillor Goldsack, and his substitute is unable to attend. Now, may I ask you to declare any conflict of interest for this meeting? There are no conflicts of interest. Okay, I'll go on to item 2, which is the chair's announcements. I hopefully, or if you haven't, let Anne Gardner know. You should have had an email about an extra meeting on the 5th of March. I see this as one of the advantages of the virtual world, that it's an extra meeting is not quite as an imposition as it would be if you had to drive somewhere. So an extra meeting on the 5th of March has been arranged, and this primary purpose of this is to have a proper and full look at the assurance framework prior to it going to the board of the combined authority. But in order to try and balance the workload as we go through the year, we'll also add another couple of items to the agenda that day, which will be information governance and the code of corporate governance. If you're unable to do the 5th of March meeting, could you let Anne know as soon as possible so that we can arrange to make sure that we're quorate on that day? The assurance framework item will also fold in the lessons from the Lancaster Way project. Is that right, Robert Parkin?
Sorry, on mute. Yes, that's correct. Correct, JP. Yep.
Thank you. Another item on our work list is the Climate Change Commission, and I've agreed that can be moved back to the April meeting, as the report is not due to be published until February, and it needs to be digested. So in the April meeting, we'll take the climate change situation. And lastly, for my announcements, I did ask the officers to have a look at our meeting programme for next year, because when the diary came out, the civic diary came out, there was only 4 meetings shown, and our workload seems, the business that we have to conduct is more than that. So there is a revised work programme and dates of meetings for 21-22, and that's at the bottom of the agenda. Okay, that's all the announcements I had. Was anybody like to ask a question about that, or are we happy? Okay, we'll move on then to the minutes of the last meeting and the action notes. Are we content with the minutes of the last meeting as a record? And are you happy for me to approve them? Thank you. Sorry, we've got Tony Mason. On mute.
Always the same. I didn't know whether you wanted to discuss or raise it later, the minutes on 2.2, the final point about the committee having the decision on whether to put in standing inquiries or not.
I didn't, unless you wish to raise it, I didn't. I know there's been correspondence between you and officers. Do you feel that item has not been dealt with?
No, it doesn't change the minutes. It's whether we will come to it after approving the minutes.
We can certainly do it under if you'd like to, before we get onto the action sheet, because it's not on the action sheet.
Yeah.
So first of all, shall we approve the minutes? Okay, right. Then Tony, maybe you'd like to raise your point about item 2, the item that you just mentioned.
Okay. So after the last meeting where we had the issues raised around the EY report outlining the payments made to the previous CFO that we were unaware of because they were not visible within the accounts and audit clearly, and we wouldn't have known about it if the EY report had not been submitted to us. I raised the question as to whether this committee should have standing inquiries as the auditors would have in any meeting that they would have with the authority, just to have a very high level view if there are any claims around fraud, whistleblowing, legal cases, etc. This is not to add any extra work, it is to inform the committee of potential aspects that should be brought to the committee in the future and that we are aware of it. My concern is that we were unaware of something until it came out and then it's almost too late. So I sent a letter to the authority. They've responded to some of those questions, but it's outlined in the minutes that, of course, it is for the committee to determine whether it would like to have standing inquiries as part of its opening to a meeting. So to address to the authority whether there are specific issues that we need to be aware of, not that we need to have detail, but that if say there was a fraud, again, at the last meeting we were informed that there were 2 issues potentially of IT fraud, that something had occurred and that there would be an investigation and the report would be brought back, or it would be 30 seconds of no, there's no fraud issues, no, there's no whistleblowing, no, there's no legal issues, no, okay, move on. So that is the situation, whether this committee would feel that would add value to the committee or whether it is a burden to the committee.
Would anybody like to comment?
If I could assist, JP, yeah. So we looked into this in response to Councillor Mason's queries, and we're looking to develop something to propose back to yourself. And I think it falls to us, JP, to come back to you with a proposal in detail, and we can bring that along to the next meeting to say, if you like, what those standing items could cover and what the constraints could be around them. So we can take any comments again today, but aim to come back to the next meeting with that.
Nick Sanford.
Yeah, I'd like to support what Councillor Mason is saying, I think, because I think if you look at the perception that a member of the public would have, they would perceive that we are an audit and governance committee. So if there were some of these irregularities were occurring, they would expect us to be, being aware of them and actually carrying out investigations. So I think I support what the officer is proposing. I would like to see a bit of clarification about how this process would work, but I very much support it in principle.
David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. It's maybe just me, but I have a problem with the terminology about a standing inquiry. If it's just a standard report of this issue, there have been issues flagged, something's being done. To me, an inquiry means we're proactively looking at something, as opposed to receiving a report and then deciding whether something needs to be looked into further.
It's inquiry, not inquiry. So, I mean, Suresh, as the auditor, for his meetings with the officers, he will start at the meeting saying, standard inquiries are, is there any issue with this? Is there any issue with this? Is there any issue with this? And the response is no, no, no. Okay, move on.
Yeah, exactly. That's proactively asking rather than receiving a report.
Yeah, it's
as to whether anything.
not an inquiry.
Chair, if I could just drop in. What we'd aim to bring back is something which offered a commentary on where and within the range of other reporting some of these points may arise. So I think, yeah, that hopefully would mean that insofar as it's something that should come to the committee, we showed where it meshed into what we were already providing you.
Nick Sanford, you've still got your hand up. Is that the same point, or you forgot to put it down?
No, sorry, I've forgotten to take it down. Yeah.
All right. Are any other members like to say anything? I think I just say that in my 4 years or so, I have never had any impression that things were not brought to us when it was appropriate. And that whilst you said we wouldn't have known, or once it was said that we wouldn't have known unless the external auditor told us about it, it seems to me that's where we have all these checks. So I look forward to getting some proposals from officers for our, would our next meeting be appropriate, or would it be the April meeting? Which do you think?
Chair, I would certainly look to bring it back to the next meeting.
Okay, and then we can take it from there. But I hope that whatever we do, we find something which is bureaucratically light. Okay, thank you. Could we move on to the action list, if that's enough discussion on that item? Don't see any hands raised. The open actions. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Most of the ones that are open will be folded into business as we go forward. Unless officers would like to comment on the item at the bottom of the first page of open actions about the question. The question there is about 3 officers mitigating on EU exit. I think that's probably, could we just have an insight to that and maybe close it down?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, for that item, at the time of the question was raised, we'd had 2 tranches of EU funding, £90,000 in 2018-19 and again in 2019-20. But no staffing had been appointed directly to be involved in the activities of that. It was to support local businesses and individuals, and to support continuity of trade and the stability of national workers. So that was used to appoint an external contractor to do that. So again, no staff were directly employed from that. And just as an update, we've recently had additional funding of £136,000. And again, that is to support businesses specifically around the future requirements of importing and exporting. And again, we're looking to contract, and I think we have actually, Cambridge Chamber of Commerce to provide the support on that. So I hope that answers that question. Thank you.
Are we content that that closes that action? Okay, could you mark that then as a done? Thank you. Any other points on actions arising from the minutes and the action list? Tony.
I noticed that there was a development session for the Committee on Trading Companies, and it certainly has to be timetabled.
It is in the work plan at item 9 for the 21-22. It is programmed in there. No other hands. Okay, let's move on then, please, if we may. And we'll invite the Chief Executive to give us a combined authority board update.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the big issue at the Combined Authority Board this month was the signing off of the medium-term financial plan and our draft business plan and the Mayor's budget. So those were really the key issues. And of course, as an Audit and Governance Committee, you have contributed towards all of that process. Accompanying that, of course, is a look at our performance report. And just a couple of highlights from there. I think you will note from your own risk register that there is the only outstanding item, the only red item on our performance report at the moment is in relation to the housing performance review. So this is a performance review that's undertaken with MHCLG. They had some questions around the business case that we entered into with them. And so they've got some ongoing discussions with us about whether they're going to continue to release the funding around that. And therefore, we've placed that onto the risk register now. The other item relating to housing, I think it was useful to draw to your attention, is that we continue to use the housing funds that we have secured, not only to deliver affordable housing in our area, but also to focus on the 100k homes. And we had the announcement this month of some 100k homes that have actually been built in Fordham, and we have people now allocated to them. And also we're just beginning our programme of community land trusts. So this is encouraging the local community to come together to actually look at how they can develop more housing and have more say in the development of housing in their area. So those are the key highlights really from our business planning and performance. If we have a look forward, related to the budget was the transport levy. So there was an item where we levy the highways authorities for funding relating to our passenger transport functions. And I think it's important to note that we are now bringing the passenger transport functions in-house as of April this year. So we are busy working on that transfer at present. So there will be a new, an increased function, I think, within in-house as of April of this year. And also looking forward, we kicked off the business growth service. So there were further items on there approving business plan for that. We also talked about the further investment into the Market Town master plans as well, and there's quite a detailed report about the number of investments that have been made around that. Also, we highlighted the investment made into the University of Peterborough, so the Getting Building Fund of over £14.5 million went into the development of the first phase of the Peterborough University building, and accompanying that we had a report coming to the board also about the Research and Development Centre, that we're also managed to work with local businesses and enhanced some investment that they have put in to create a new Research and Development Centre to sit alongside the Peterborough University as well. And actually not only have they invested, but the report coming back saying they've actually increased their investment now. And I think the total investment for the research centre, I think, is around £19 million now for that site. Elsewhere, if we look, there was a lot of, there wasn't actually a CAM report on the board this month, but there was a lot of questions from scrutiny around the CAM, as well as some comments from some of the members that they would like to have more visibility around what's going on with the CAM. It is an excessively busy area of work for us within the Combined Authority at the moment, but because we haven't reached a point where any formal decision making is required, there wasn't a report at the board, but we have committed to the members that we will bring some further information back about the work that's going on. So just to let members know, there was a decision in the summer of last year that we were going to unpick the way that we were delivering the CAM project and look at putting it back together as a single network programme with the GCP very firmly and ourselves very firmly and closely working together to produce a single business case for the whole programme. And that's what we've been working on, as well as some developments around new technology for the vehicles, very much looking forward to that clean growth agenda. So there will be lots of information coming forward on that. And then I suppose finally to say, well, I suppose there's a couple of things. If we're looking outwards outside of the combined authority, there's a lot of work going on around the Oxcam ARC. A prospectus was put to government looking at how, in particular, the local enterprise partnerships across the ARC, which includes our business board, can actually contribute towards the success of the ARC through its opportunities for increased science and technology developments. And so we've entered into a partnering strategy to work with the LEPs and the universities across the ARC to contribute towards what the ARC is trying to do. A big issue there, I think, for our business board, and one that we think may be coming down the line, is how they're going to be funded in the future, because now that we have exited out of Europe, we won't have access to the same funds that we relied on previously to support some of the work of the LEPs. But government, as you know, is looking at a levelling up fund and a UK shared prosperity fund, and we're just waiting for details from government for how that is going to work in the future. And then finally, I think just to round up to say, we have elections coming up. This will be our first, apart from obviously when we installed our mayoral elections, this is the first time we've had an incumbent mayor and elections coming up. And so we appointed our combined authority returning officers, and Robert was tasked with producing some pre-election guidance around that for members and officers to be aware of the extra restrictions that we have to put in place as we prepare for the elections. So that is a sort of very summary and very dense but short overview of what is occurring within the combined authority, and happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Kim. There's a couple of hands up. Nick Sanford.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I just like to ask a question about the change in public transport funding, because strategic transport has always been a combined authority responsibility, but up to now you've decided to delegate the funding back to the councils. Could you just explain why you've decided to change that, and sort of going on from that? I think there's some concern in Peterborough that the combined authority is seen as a bit of a remote institution that people don't really know much about. So how will you, and some really key decisions about, you know, which bus services to support and that sort of thing. So how will you ensure that the views of local councillors and the views of local people are taken into account?
Yeah, good questions, Councillor Sanford. So the change has arisen because, as you know, when we negotiated our devolution deal, transport wasn't in the original list of asks that the combined authority had on its menu of services. But at the very last minute, the Transport Minister said that he didn't see how a combined authority could operate without the transport functions, and so those were included in. As a result of that, we thought the best way to operate, considering that we were the newest partnership of all the combined authorities, the best way to operate was to allow the status quo to continue, and we would in the meantime just adjust our budgeting, but all the transport would continue to be delivered by Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. I think we're at the point now where we really need to start to assume that transport function centrally. We've approved our first local transport plan, so we've got a clear strategic direction now about where our transport functions are going, but we need to now start to deliver operationally under that strategy. So now is the appropriate time to bring that into the combined authority. Yes, I understand your concerns that we might be seen as too remote. But however, I think it strikes me transport is one of those areas where you can't be too remote from the public, because actually they're very, very interested in how passenger transport is delivered, and they will soon find a way to ask questions of the combined authority and its transport committee about how we're delivering those passenger transport in the future. There are open platforms that we can engage both the public the community who are receiving those services, and also local councillors, because as you know, our transport committee is drawn from one councillor from each of our district councils, Peterborough and the county. So what we are doing, and one thing that we have asked our monitoring officer Robert to do, is to put together transport induction training for members so that they are fully aware of what their new responsibilities will be when they assume all of these new functions. So I hope that answers your questions, Councillor Sanford. I think it'll be something to keep an eye on, and then great, you know, that we'll be willing to learn the lessons, I think, from Cambridgeshire and Peterborough about how we can ensure that we have that really good relationship with the public.
Okay, thank you.
Mike Davey.
Thank you, Chair. Kim, two questions. One, again, going back to the CAM, but specifically around the Transport Committee. There was some debate in overview and scrutiny. I have to obviously separate my scrutiny hat from my audit and governance hat, but there was some issues about how the Transport Committee was going to operate, because obviously that would have implications for the Audit Committee in terms of the governance arrangement. And the second one was a more general question about the mayoral elections. As you'll be aware, elsewhere in the country, there's a lot of concern at the government's desire to crack on with May. Basically, it appears very difficult to understand how it can possibly happen, given it's unlikely people will still be safe by then. I just wondered what the mayoral, and specifically yourself, whether you're working with other authorities to negotiate how we might look at that as a relatively sensible option. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, on the CAM, yes, the key change for the Transport Committee is learning about the functions that it's going to have to deliver as a passenger transport, but also alongside of that, what we have discovered as we're trying to move through this and build this one CAM approach is that the Transport Committee and the GCP are going to have to work very much more hand in glove going forward, because after all, this is a single network. It will be a single programme. And Rachel and I, who's the Chief Executive at the GCP, have started to have more regular meetings through what we call a steering group, a GCP steering group, to look at how we can work together to ensure that our Transport Committee are much better informed about what's going on within the GCP, but also that we find a way that if we have concerns that we want to raise about the network, or just things that we would like to feed in and engage better, that we have a constructive way of doing that. Because if we don't have a way of doing that in a political sort of and a formal governance structure, then the only place to go with that is out into the press and out into the public. And actually it's much better that as public authorities we find a way to work together constructively, because we both want to achieve the same thing, which is a really good passenger transport network that beginning in Cambridge and ultimately going out to all of those various routes. And I should just add, I forgot to say in my opening part, that we haven't forgotten that at the Audit Committee, the Mayor did commit that he would get people together who are interested in the CAM of the future, going out to more regional areas like Chatteris and various other places and Peterborough. And that's still very much on the agenda, and one thing we have added to the CAM work programme to look at how we can build that network of the future, in the same way as that, you know, the London Underground never stops evolving. We see the CAM as not never stopping evolving. What we've got now is the base network that we need going forward. So does that answer your question, Councillor Davey?
I think so, Kim. The issue was whether or not there was, I know there was some concerns over the proposals that had gone to the board, and I just wanted to make sure that it was resolved, because clearly from our position as a governance committee, it's making sure that the GCP and the CPCA and indeed the new One CAM board work effectively together, because if they don't, we don't want to be washing our clothes in, what's the phrase? I was going to pick the metaphors, but we don't want to be dirty washing in public, I think is what I'm trying to say. And therefore for us as an audit committee, we have to make sure that the governance is effective. And I know there was some concerns as to the proposals, but I think you've answered the question, Kim.
Yeah.
Thank you. David Brown.
I didn't come back to you on the mayoral elections. Sorry, that was the second.
Okay.
So yes, we are working closely with the district councils. As you know, it's been very public that Robert Jenrick has made representations to government that he doesn't think the election should go ahead. Nonetheless, they are going ahead. So we have to plan for them now. As you know, there is a long run-in time for elections. So we have started to work with the district councils to plan for that. We are looking, John is looking at the budget. And we will just have to monitor this as it goes along. We're also working with the other mayoral combined authorities who are all having, I think nearly all of them are having elections this year. And they're making their own representations as well to government around that. But there is a mixed view there as well. So some of the combined authorities think it is feasible to proceed, but you will need additional budget in order to make appropriate arrangements for COVID safe elections. And then others don't see at the moment how they can proceed. So it's a very much watch this space. But yes, we are working closely with the districts on that.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you.
David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Kim. Thanks for the update. I just wanted to add one little bit into your update. You mentioned about the 100k homes at Fordham. Just to let people know that the first residents moved into the Haddenham CLT this week.
Yes, and that was actually also mentioned at board, and I should have mentioned it because it's a very important project actually. And Councillor Bailey did actually give an update to the board about that. Thank you.
Tony Mason.
Right, I was just on the community land trusts. I'm just unsure how the community land trusts will interface with the planning requirements and at the moment in South Cambs we're looking at going out and getting those requests for sites and reviewing our planning going ahead. So it's how that community land trust process will interface or interact with that planning process that we are now going through.
Yeah, well, I can't profess to be an expert around how the community land trusts work, but my understanding is that they will get together their proposals and then go through the planning process in the same way. Community land trusts tend to be sites smaller than you would see perhaps necessarily in a call for sites, but I won't profess to know any more than that, Councillor Mason, but I can certainly ask Emma Grimmer, who's leading this on behalf of the authority, to provide you with an update on how that whole process works and how community land trusts operate. I do know we have had some in South Cambs previously. I think there were 2 projects in South Cambs around community land trusts. So they do operate very well. We do have a team who have some experience of dealing with this in the past.
Thank you. No more. Thank you very much, Kim. I just reiterate how important it is, I think, to members of this committee to get this insight to the business of the combined authority in a way that we wouldn't normally see through the papers that are put in front of us. So thank you very much. That concludes item 4. If we could move on now to item 5, which is the internal audit report, which we're asked to note, including the report on risk management. John Alsop.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so this paper is to provide an update on the work that RSM have conducted against the internal audit plan to date. They, as you recall, presented at the November meeting. It also provides the conclusions and recommendations of their review of risk management. And being the first audit that they have completed since they've been appointed, we thought it was appropriate to provide this report in full as an example of the format of the other reports to follow. Obviously, risk management is central to the focus of the audit plan. And whilst the report recognised that the organisation is making some good progress towards embedding risk management processes, action is still needed to strengthen the control framework. So we've reviewed all of their recommendations. We've accepted the recommendations, and there is an action to implement them by the 31st of March. And we suggest that we bring a report back to the committee at some point after that to update the committee on progress. But I'd like to hand over to Dan and Jay from RSM to provide their report. So thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, John, and good morning, everyone. John's obviously sort of introduced that nicely. I think the other thing I was just going to say in terms of sort of progress against the programme. So if you look at page 30 of the papers and Appendix A, you can see we make reference to the key financial controls audit, which is also in progress. We received the final information for that this week, so that will debrief next week. So we'll get a draft report out very soon after that. Scopes have been agreed for remaining audits, and we've got a further 2 audits being undertaken in February. So you can clearly see the remaining timeline for the rest of this year's plan of work. I mean, again, I'm in sort of members' hands. We've put 2 client briefings and attached those onto the progress report. Happy that we either send those to you outside of the meeting or continue to incorporate those as part of the progress report, but going forward. So happy to receive any thoughts on that. And as John alluded to, just in terms of this being the first final report that we have undertaken, we're proposing and sort of agreed with the chair that in future meetings, certainly for positive opinion reports, it would literally just be an executive summary that we would incorporate within your papers attached to this progress report. It would only be on where we got some sort of more significant findings, so either a partial or no assurance report where you would see this level of detail. But as explained, we thought it would be helpful. So John's already nicely summarised that, you know, we do feel that you're obviously on a journey with risk management, and there was a new strategy introduced only this time last year. So clearly that is still being embedded and still being rolled out, and you'll see that we've identified a number of issues, so around sort of risk register completeness, some of the training that's been rolled out, just improving that and having that go a little bit further. Some of the risk register content, there's some further clarity, and indeed on some of the sort of more operational registers, some of those weren't fully complete at the time that we undertook the review. So we've obviously agreed an action around that being addressed. You may have noted a particular action has been agreed in relation to this committee's role. I think page 43 of your pack, where we are specifically, I think we've just noted that the strategy suggests that your role is to not only consider the corporate risk register, but you will also look at mitigating actions and assurances. But I think the corporate risk register you've been receiving to date didn't have that information. So again, we saw a disconnect there. So again, we've just agreed an action that clearly, if that is going to be your role, that information needs to be provided to you in full, or if it's not, to provide an update to the strategy. And I think finally, we've made some reference to the use of assurances and mapping assurances back to your risk register, because ultimately that's what gives you confidence that your controls and your mitigations to bring you down to your residual risk scores and confidence that those residual risk scores are indeed accurate. Final point from me, John's already mentioned it, but I think it is important that all of these actions have been agreed to be implemented this financial year. So we're hoping that we could do some follow-up sort of very early in April, just to further support our year-end opinion. And hopefully we'll see a number of these areas that sort of moved on in the last quarter. But happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. Nick Sanford.
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting a bit confused about which document we're referring to, because page 43 was mentioned, and I can't find a page 43 in any of the documents.
So, Councillor, it was I'm going on the sort of PDF version, so page 43 of 178. Apologies if I've got a slightly different copy. Alternatively, that is page 5 of the full risk management report.
Right.
Yes, Nick, I fell into the same trap. I'd open each document individually, but if you take the pack, you can get the pages that were mentioned.
Yeah, it's just we can't. It's really difficult. He was talking really quickly, and it's really difficult to follow if the page don't correspond.
Would you like Daniel to repeat that area where you had a question?
Yeah, well, you could just go through this bit about page 43 because I was trying to find it, but I couldn't.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, I think it's actually page 5 in the bottom right-hand corner of our full risk management report. There's a section halfway down that page that's headed up reporting framework in bold, and then corporate level is underlined.
Yeah, okay, I've got that. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so it was just in relation to that particular point that I was pulling out the fact that we've made specific reference to the fact that the risk management strategy states that it's the Audit and Governance Committee's responsibility to review the corporate risk register together with progress of mitigating actions and assurances. And I think what we'd identified by looking at the papers you'd received was that the mitigating actions and assurances were not currently documented in the corporate risk register that you'd received, and therefore we couldn't obviously see clear evidence that you could discharge that element of the risk management, what the risk management strategy refers to. So hence we've agreed an action around that.
Okay, thank you.
Mike Davey.
Thank you, Chair. My question is about its relation to, I think it's page 52 of my pack, which is, it's the heading is monitoring arrangements for portfolio program and project registers. I hope that makes sense. And because I understand, if I've got it right, and please correct me if I've got it wrong, obviously the main area of how this is managed is through the risk register of how the authority operates. But because so much of the authority's work is delegated through programs and projects to a range of companies that then deliver on behalf of the combined authority, clearly from our perspective, it's about the risk that those companies might engender, i.e., for example, with the CAM Metro, One CAM, the company. Now, in that section there, I'm not clear I understand if that's the route that we would look at risk for those companies, because if it is, there's an indication there that the risk registers have yet to be put in place for those portfolios. And I suppose it's therefore for the question ultimately is about how do we, and I'll use One CAM again as an example, how do we identify, how does this committee get its hands on the risk register for the One CAM company in terms of delivering the CAM Metro? And is it the responsibility of the company to do that, or is it the responsibility of the members of the officers of the combined authority to do that? And presumably, do they report to us as the Audit and Governance Committee, or do they then report through the Companies Act through to the risk register of the One CAM company? So a bit of clarity over the governance arrangements about risk there would be really helpful, because I fear it might be my confusion, but nonetheless, I'd welcome some clarity.
Is that an officer's answer required?
I suppose the question is, who looks at the risk? And I use One CAM because this is the first one I can think of. Who looks at the risk register for the One CAM company? Is it the company? Is it the officers? Is it the audit committee? And how do we get hold of that? Because clearly with the One CAM, could be in such a project that's going to cost billions, there's going to be one or two big risks. So I'm just trying to establish who it is from this that might be responsible for looking at a risk register.
Yeah. So just to give you as an example, the CAM project, there's a responsibility on both sides is the simple answer. So in the combined authority, we have spent quite a lot of time building our performance framework. And within that, we do regular monthly highlight reports on every key project that we've got. So the team that are working on the CAM has to produce a highlight report every month. That goes into a framework which is thereby everything is assessed, and that results in the summary performance framework that you saw and I talked about earlier that is reported to the board. And if everything is on track, then it will show as green. If it's slightly off track, it's amber. And of course, if it's not really performing against expected targets, it's the red. Members also receive confidentially, because a lot of that information contains commercially sensitive details. Members do receive some information confidentially, and if at any time you wanted to have a look at that performance framework and you wanted to dig a bit deeper on how that performance framework works, because after all you are responsible for processes and procedures, then I think you'll start to see that when you start looking at the deep dive around the assurance framework to see how our whole process works, because the assurance framework captures all of that. So we have a quite well worked up project and performance framework within the combined authority. The One CAM Limited, they've only had one board meeting, and that was just to establish themselves. And they will continue. We are at the moment, the work is ongoing to look at them building up their internal processes. So they will become responsible for the risk register around any work that they are delivering. But as yet, we haven't really transitioned any work into that new company. But believe me, one of the things that Lord Mayor was very keen to impress upon me as chair of that One CAM Limited is how focused he is around the risks of the company. He has therefore included within the organisation of that company an audit and risk committee. And he has also spoken to the non-exec directors about how keen he would be to get a risk register up and running as quickly as possible, because I think he's coming from a very commercially focused background where risk, as you know, drives a lot of the business in the organisation. So I think they begin by looking at risk and they finish by looking at risk at their board meetings. And so there will be a key focus on there, but that is still developing. So that's just to give you an idea.
So the answer is we're not sure yet, and therefore it's just to be clarity. Ultimately, is it expected that this committee will be looking at the risks in relating to One CAM and the other companies, or is it expected that the company will be responsible for that? Because that clearly has a significant role in terms of how we operate. I realise, and I have no problem with the delegation down to companies, but it's about where's our box, if you like. What do we have responsibility for, and what does the Lord Mayor's company have responsibility for? So it looks like the government's arrangements have yet to be finalised from what you're saying, Kim.
And the arrangements as well between us are still yet to be finalised. We have a draft shareholder agreement which sets out how the two will operate. But until I've got the non-exec directors of the One CAM up and running, I won't exactly understand what their view is of the shareholder agreement. At that point, then we will begin to have some conversations about that responsibility, how answerable One CAM is to the combined authority. And then, of course, the combined authority board has responsibility for the risk register. We all, as an executive team, have responsibility for ensuring that's correct and bringing it here for you to have oversight of. But ultimately, it's the combined authority board who has the responsibility for that risk register. So it will be keen to ensure that it's getting appropriate and has appropriate oversight of all the risks with the CAM and all of the projects that it has oversight of.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you.
It seems to me that when we look at the assurance framework, could I ask that the paper that comes to us draws our attention to this relationship of the risk between the authority, the audit committee, and the companies, and even if it is not, it's not finalised yet, the principles of assurance and relationships are there, or if they're not there, there's an action to pursue them as this arrangement gets more mature. Thank you. I don't see any more hands up. I think I'd like, if I just summarise then, we'll continue with the arrangement whereby if an audit is less than the standard, that means partial or no, that we will see the full report. But otherwise, as we've done since we began, we'll get a summary or an executive insight into reports that are satisfactory. And I think it's worth noting that this is, to my recollection, this is only the second internal audit report that we've had since the start of the combined authority, which has been less than the standard, i.e. partial. So I'm very grateful for the intention to update the committee on progress in implementing the recommendations. And I'd also be grateful for an insight as to what extent, because risk is so central, is how officers intend to update the combined authority board that we've had this report. It shows that the commitment of the organisation to improve its risk, that they've been taken on board, the recommendations, and that we'll be progressing. But it probably is worth reporting that in a synopsis form the next time you brief the board on the risk. Are officers content with that approach?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think that's a really good idea. And I'd like to say I really welcome the report we received today. It was very clear, and also it gave us a lot that will really help us improve our risk reporting. So I really welcome that. Thank you.
Okay. And I think I'd like to finish on that point too. This is the first product from our new internal auditors, and I felt it not only it was readable, but it gave one assurance that the way that they'd approached the problem had got into the organisation proper and how things were actually happening, and that we were getting an insight to that. So I very much welcome that. So thank you very much, RSM.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work, I think, is the tick at this stage. Okay.
Thank you.
Shall we move on then to item 6, which nicely segues, is the corporate risk register.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so Chair and committee members, this item is asking you to review the corporate risk register and also the corporate risk management strategy. Heavy caveat, we've just heard some detailed findings of our internal auditor on our approach to risk management and the risk register as well. You'll appreciate that what's being presented is we're still essentially conducting a work in progress to respond to those actions. So please bear that in mind. And you'll see among the recommendations are that I bring back a report to this committee in relation to the risk management strategy that picks up on the recommendations of the internal auditor on the strategy and also the register itself. The register's provided to you. I'll just go through down the report to highlight some points to you. We've also had a go at producing a heat map, which I'll ask Anne to try to govern you through, but essentially is looking to indicate movements on risks. The risk we were tasked or have been tasked in earlier sessions to try to make the risk register more digestible. Inevitably, it's a detailed document, and the report of the internal auditor, I think, indicates why that is. It's a central document to the auditor's work, and therefore it's very important that we develop our approach to it. If you're able to open and look at the risk register and move across, you can see the spectrum, the life cycle of a risk, through the cause, risk, event, effect, the start point, risk, and then mitigation actions, mitigation plan, and mitigation action, assurance actions there are as well. And on the right hand side of the table is our residual risk. So is indicating the status there. Lots of commentary in the boxes there that are looking to respond to the risk and to commit to mitigation and assurance actions. I'll just, if I can, turn back to the report. And yes, and just highlight some key ones for us. Now, get to the right documents. Yeah, so yeah, here we go. Significant items are in particular focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts that that has internally and externally. It's looking at potential internal and external disruption, and the risk rating has moved up in recent weeks and months to red. Risk ID 21 is the MHCLG review of the £100 million housing programme. That's considered to be a high risk at the moment. It's still work is still in progress to resolve that issue. I might invite John Allsop to offer any additional commentary on that, if you'd like to hear any. And paragraph 2.7, risk ID 1 relates to the financial position of constituent authorities. They're key delivery partners for the CPCA, and our analysis is indicating to us that there may be heightened risks in relation to their financial position and how that may impact on the delivery of CPCA schemes. And you'll see again in the mitigation actions, we're looking at, or we note potential alternative options for any risk impacts there. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Francesca, welcome. As the person who wrestles with this at the action level, are there any points you'd like to bring it to our attention in addition to what Robert Parkin has said before we have a debate?
There's nothing additional I'd like to add. Okay.
So we're asked to review and have any recommendations or changes to go to the board. I don't see any hands up. I'm sure there's something to say on this key matter. Or do we feel that in the light of the report from the internal auditors, we'd rather wait? Mike Davey.
I feel as though, as Robert invited us to ask about the money that's missing from the MHCLG, I think it'd be helpful if John did give us an update.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. Yes, just really, I think Kim touched on this earlier on. It was talked about at the Combined Authority Board meeting, and I think it also over in scrutiny earlier on in the week. I think obviously there has been a lot of discussions between the Mayor and officers with central government. There are still issues, those discussions are ongoing. I think the Mayor is confident that the funding will materialise, but obviously in terms of the risk, the longer that the funds haven't been received, then it creates some issues in terms of our delivery and our ability to be able to make our commitments on our housing delivery. But at the moment we are, the MTFP, all of our assumptions are that the funding will come in. And we are sort of confident on that basis, but we obviously recognise that as a risk.
Sorry, Chair, is it okay just to ask one follow-up question?
Yes, please continue.
John, and again, I realised, obviously, because I was in scrutiny earlier on in the week, so I realised there's no definitive, but it might be helpful again for the record. When was the money first expected? So it's just a question of the timeline. It was back in the autumn, wasn't it?
Yeah. So there was 2 years worth of funding that we are currently expecting. And that totals 45 million out of the £100 million pot. So yeah, so the final tranche should have been received this year.
David Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just a couple of very brief points. Firstly, yes, I think we do need to wait for Robert Parkin's follow-up report as proposing any changes. And just presentation-wise, because I don't know about this, but because I'm looking at this on a screen, in future, could we have the heat map after the corporate risk register and before the strategy? Because if I'm trying to compare the heat map against the register, I've got to wade all the way through the strategy before I can look back at the risk register. So again, it's just a presentation thing, but I would find it much easier if it went immediately after the risk register.
Okay, thank you. I think we should take your suggestion that we won't make any recommendations on the register itself until we've had the follow-up report of folding in what has been identified during the internal audit. On presentation, this has been a wrestle all the time because there's a huge amount of data which has to be coalesced into something to give us an overview. And I know that the Combined Authority have almost continuously worked on improving it. Do we feel now that we're subject to the sequencing that we just heard from David Brown, how do we feel about the way the information is presented and enabling us to look at it in a way that we can add proper scrutiny value? Do we feel the format we're now getting into it fits the bill, or is there anything else that we're concerned about? I'll take that then that we've cracked it, and that I still don't know what our top 3 risks are. I'd always like to see in your paper what the top 3 risks are, but that's a personal view about understanding what is the top of the minds in the organisation. But otherwise, I think we should be grateful. And sorry, Daniel Harris.
Sorry, Chair. The one thing I would just make reference to back to our report is we obviously made the commentary around the use of assurances. So that might just be the only thing that needs to be thought about. Again, whether you can rag rate something to keep it easy for the committee, but I think what that's just is provide you with confidence that the controls that you've already got in place or the mitigations already in place, if, for example, you had an internal audit review or you felt some of the external auditors' work could contribute to one of those mitigations, that's the only thing that I would just say needs to be given some thought. But we could perhaps offer our advice to officers outside of the committee as to how we see that work on other registers.
I think that would be very helpful, Daniel. And can we record that in the notes of the meeting? But otherwise, I think we should be, I hope officers will feel that they've pretty much close to a format in which gives us the insights that we need in order to take a view. So thank you very much for that. We won't make any recommendations at this stage. We'll wait for the update, and we heard from the previous item that where we are on the outcome of the internal audit will be conveyed to the board. So I don't see any other hands up, so thank you very much. We'll move on to happiness and light, which is external audit.
So shall I just introduce that,
yes,
that paper?
Yeah.
Thank you. So this paper is to provide the committee with EY's annual audit letter, which communicates to members the key issues arising from EY's work, which they consider should be brought to the attention of the Combined Authority. And I'd like to hand over to Suresh from EY to provide the detail behind the report. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Chair, for that introduction. I'm not sure if I've ever had an audit report described as happiness and light, but I'll take that. So the audit letter is really just a summary of what we've already reported to you, particularly at the last audit committee in November, where you approved your 1920 accounts, and obviously we were then able to issue our audit opinion on the same day, which enabled you to publish your accounts by the end of November, which, as you know, was the target date for accounts for 1920. So obviously we were all pleased to be able to do that. So I wasn't proposing to go in any great detail other than on the fees page, which is right at the end of the report, because that's the only thing that's really changed. And you'll see there that following completion of the audit, we've then finalised our final fees. We have provided John with some detail behind those fees in terms of what the work was, who actually carried out the work in terms of the grade and the associated costs. So John has had that information, and we've had a discussion, and we have agreed those fees, which I will now send to PSA for final approval. The only other thing I just wanted to highlight was just looking ahead to 2021. Which, you know, we never stop, do we, in terms of financial accounting? So you will probably have heard MHCLG's proposal that the reporting target date is going to be the end of September. I don't think that's been formally issued yet, but that was their response to the Redmond review. And we will be sitting down with John and Rob in due course to agree a timetable that will enable us collectively to be able to do that. So our plan would be to be able to meet that reporting end of September date for 2021. The one thing that has changed is a new code of audit practice for 2021, and the main changes around value for money, slight change in the kind of criteria that we are required to consider, but the bigger change is how we report our conclusions, I suspect. So we no longer have to do a kind of binary conclusion in our audit opinion, but we will provide you a commentary on those three criteria that the NAO has now specified. So slightly different, and probably more narrative for you as a committee to be comfortable with in terms of what we ultimately report. But I'll stop there, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Any questions from colleagues? As I said, happiness and light. How is this opinion and conclusion conveyed to the board? Do we wait until we provide our annual report as a committee, or how is it done?
I think that's a question for officers.
Yeah, so we will be providing, we provide a finance update to every board meeting. So at the next board meeting, we will put a summary of the audit and the recommendations and the findings of the auditors. So we'll take that to the next board meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Any other comments on this item? No, thank you, and thank you very much, Suresh. Let's move on then to item 8, which is Treasury Management Strategy. And we're asked to review the strategy and to note the in-year performance. And I think Rob Emery is going to introduce.
Thanks, Chair. Firstly, I should apologise to the committee. The capital strategy was not circulated in advance of the meeting due to a clerical error. It has now arrived in your inboxes, I hope, but only in the last sort of half an hour, so with no chance to be reviewed. Fortunately, in terms of the capital strategy specifically, there's very few changes to the current version and the proposed version, and the current version was discussed by the committee last year. I'll highlight the changes as I go through, but if members would like, I'm happy to bring that specific strategy back to a future meeting. In terms of our financial strategies, there's 4 main documents that set out at a high level how the combined authority will manage its money to achieve its aims. The assurance framework and the constitution, which I'm sure you're familiar with, set out how we make our decisions on an individual project level, and the financial strategies wrap around the whole of the capital programme and treasury management to set limits against which we report to ensure the authority as a whole is acting prudentially. As mentioned earlier, the majority of these strategies have not changed significantly since the version that's currently in force. So I'm going to just focus your attention on what has changed. Across the whole suite of them, there's various limits on investments and forecasts which have been updated to reflect the capital programme that was approved on Wednesday by the board. I won't go into those in details because they are just taken from the approved budget and they don't reflect any change that should be of particular interest to the committee. So starting with the capital strategy, as it's the overarching one, the only significant change is that is recognition that the CAM funding and financing programme is proceeding apace, and there's quite likely that part of that financing will include public sector borrowing via the combined authority. Given how huge this project is, there's very little in the current capital strategies that recognise any element of this, on the basis that if it does come through and there is significant borrowing required by the combined authority, we'll have to fundamentally rewrite our entire financial strategy to reflect that. And if that does happen, there'll be a large lead in time for us to brief members and work through any changes that will happen in that when that happens. Then going on to the investment strategy, this covers our non-treasury investments, so everything we do in terms of service outcomes. So housing loans are one of the bigger ones that goes into here, as well as the local growth fund loans. It would also cover any investments we make for commercial purposes, but the combined authority has none of those currently and has no plans in the medium term to make such investments. There's only one significant change to the investment strategy, and that also impacts on the treasury management strategy. And that's a change in focus on the proposed top-up fund to the £40 million housing investment fund. Previously, the intention was to top up that fund using treasury management balances. But as we've progressed throughout the last year and looking at our medium-term forecast of treasury balances, that they are reducing significantly over the next 2 years. As such, that would very much limit the length of the loans we could offer in that top-up fund. So instead, and in line with what was already identified in the strategies last year, we're moving to looking at topping that up from loan backing it. So getting loans probably from PWLB and then on loaning to fund those projects. Because state aid actually controls the rates we can offer on those loans, there shouldn't be any change to the rates we can offer projects. Due to this change, it just gives us more flexibility on the length of the loans we could then offer. Moving on to the treasury management strategy, which is probably the one that this committee is most familiar with. There's a few updates to talk about in this one. The first is a simple presentational update, which is that the counterparty limits in table 2, which I'll just get a page number. It's page 128, if any of the committee want the reference. These have just been simplified. There's only one material change to the actual limits that the authority has with these counterparties, which I'll come on to in a sec. Other than that, it is just making it easier to read. That one change is related to the money market funds, where our strategy prior to this week had a £100 million limit on total investments with money market funds. And this has changed to no limit. This was advised to us by our treasury management advisors, Arling Close, and it's mostly based on an increased risk to other potential liquid investments due to the impact of the coronavirus on international markets. It also is helpful to us in terms of our need for short-term liquidity as we're moving forwards in our delivery of programs. The third is a change to our interest risk indicator, which is indicator number 10. And this is increasing from 1 million to 1.5 million, and that's on page 131. This is effectively a measure of how much of our treasury management investments are in short-term liquid investments. So what would happen if there was a 1% increase or decrease to the rates we can achieve overnight? So anything that's going to mature tomorrow would be hugely impacted by this, and anything locked in for a year or longer would have no impact. Our current limit on that, as I mentioned, is 1 million. And as we'll come to in later when we're talking about this year's performance, we've actually been breaching that in normal operations. The primary reason for that is that we're spending more, and that's entirely in line with what the combined authority are trying to achieve. Our projects are ramping up, and thus we require more cash in a shorter time frame, and thus our exposure to interest rate risk is increasing. Given that this is an indicator that when we breach, we're obliged to come and talk to you and explain ourselves, it seemed sensible to us to increase this to mean that we weren't constantly breaching it in normal operation, because there's no point in us highlighting to you everything's going fine. Oh, by the way, we've gone past this limit. As a note of reassurance, this is an absolute upper limit, that 1.5 million. This would require interest rates to drop from 0.1 as they are now to minus 9.9% overnight, which is a far bigger change than the Bank of England has done in years. They're only now exploring the possibility of negative interest rates. It also assumes that none of our maturing investments are actually spent. So actually, as that money matures and we spend it, we then wouldn't come anywhere near that level of risk. So the likelihood of that loss is negligible. Finally, there's our MRP policy, which is minimum revenue provision. This is the allowance we have to put into our revenue budget to pay for any borrowing we have. It's equivalent to the interest payment on a very broad level. As we don't charge MRP on loans that we've made, because effectively, if we've got an income source to match to our repayments to PWLB, we don't need to make another allowance for it. And within our medium-term strategy, we have no borrowing that wouldn't then be used to make loans to another organisation. So we're still expecting our MRP to be 0 for the medium term. I will have a pause there for questions on the strategies, because the rest I'm going to talk about are actual in-year performance.
Okay, so this is a pause for strategy. We've got a few hands up. Nick Sanford.
Yes, I've got a couple of points. I think as a matter of process, although I'm sure there's nothing sinister in the capital strategy, I think the fact it's only been presented to us halfway through the meeting, I think we should probably have that brought back to a subsequent meeting, just so that we can be seen to be sort of actually reviewing it. My second point was, I appreciate you saying in the investment strategy that we currently don't have any commercial investments, but if we were to have them, would the combined authority apply any sort of ethical or environmental criteria? And what I'm thinking about there is we're going to be having a report from the Climate Commission, and that will make recommendations. It would seem an odd situation if we were then to go and start investing in things that ran contrary to things that the Climate Commission was putting forward. And the third point I wanted to make was, because these strategies tend to be quite detailed, and we've just had an outline of where the changes are, but would it be possible in future to have the changes sort of highlighted, so when we're sort of reading through them we can see where the documents have altered?
I'll go in a slightly out of order because they're quicker to answer. As I said at the beginning, I'm very happy to bring the capital strategy back. I could do that at the next meeting, which would mean it's in time to have any comments you have input into the board version that goes at the end of March.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of providing a changed mapped version of the strategies in future, absolutely. And indeed for the capital strategy one, I'll ensure that that version is also circulated to members.
Thank you.
And then finally, in terms of commercial investments and the criteria for them, I'm not sure the combined authority has actually thought about that in any detail because we haven't planned for it. We have the environmental, I think it's task force going on at the moment, who are going to come back with recommendations in the forthcoming financial year. And I know that the combined authority is committed to implementing those recommendations. So if that body do recommend them, I would expect us to be taking them up. But as I say, we have not made any particular consideration of it.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Anything else, Nick, before I move on?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, Tony Mason.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Nick, I mean, around the commercial investments in the property, simple thing is that the table has an error on page 140. But on we're saying that there is no, because the authority does not invest in property and currently has no intention to do so. The understanding I have is that there is a restriction now on investing for yield, which a lot of councils have in the past gone for. Does any of the loans potentially from the PWLB fall foul of that, of being seen as being investing for yield, or are the loans clear enough that they will be seen as in investments for property, the development of housing?
So we've had a look into, as you mentioned, the PWLB have done a review of that, and they've reduced their rates by 1%, but then said that they'll effectively ban borrowing from local authorities that are investing for yield. There's a difference in local authority definitions between a service investment and a commercial investment. So as long as our primary aim is the delivery of social housing in our investments, and that our overall revenue budget isn't propped up by the returns from those loans, we don't think we should fall foul of that. Before we make any individual loans, we would of course undertake more detailed due diligence.
Do you have any further comments, Tony? Or you said there was an error on page 1?
Yeah, on the total investments, it says 1799. It should be 199. It's just an extra.
What
number.
page was that?
Page 140.
140. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh yes, that would be a very large investment, wouldn't it?
Okay. I don't see any other hands up. Could I just ask how and who audits how the implementation of the strategy works? Is that internal or external?
I would have thought it's across both. And please jump in, internal and external audit representatives. I would have thought internal audit would be reviewing whether we have the controls in place to ensure we are implementing those and that they're functioning correctly, and then external audit would take an exception view. Does that sound right?
Yeah, we also consider the kind of overarching approach in terms of, is it in line with the relevant guidance and regulations, and then obviously is it accounted for appropriately and disclosed in the accounts as it should be.
So we can take the assurance that you don't raise anything in that area as that is satisfactory, if not better than satisfactory. Okay. An internal audit, do we have this anywhere in our sites?
Yeah, no, we absolutely would, Chair. We're over the next sort of 6 weeks, we are drafting next year's strategy, which will come to your April meeting for approval. So we could certainly have a discussion around treasury management, but we incorporate that in a number of other local authority plans. So it would be around looking at your strategy. Is that well designed? Are you actually then complying with your strategy in terms of your investments, any interest received, any etc., etc. So yeah, it would absolutely be a review or part of our key financial controls coverage, one or the other.
Okay, I'm very grateful if we could make sure those 2 responses from the auditors are reflected in the minutes, because I think that assurance that it's not that it falls within the normal program of auditing is very useful. And I'm also grateful for the comments from members, because this is a big subject, and it's important that we do keep our eye, even though there's many pages of it. So that is good, and I like the way in which Rob, you've introduced it, and we look forward to having the capital strategy tucked into our next meeting with the changes highlighted. Thank you. Don't see any more hands up. Thank you very much. So that brings us to item 9, which is the work.
Chair.
Yep.
That paper also covers in-year Treasury management.
Sorry. Yes, I was trying to get on. You held me back, which is fair. Go
on. So I'll be quite brief on this to just highlight our overall performance and where the authority market is. As you can see from the table on page 116, our average return has dropped, although not nearly as much as it did in the first half of the year. We've also done somewhat better than the local authority sector as a whole, as you can see from the graph on page 117, in that we've dropped, but not as much as everybody else. And this is due to us having a relatively low risk portfolio, which means all of our investments, we've not lost value on any of them, whereas some other authorities have relatively high risk portfolios and have actually lost the value of those as if you'd invested in a share and the company had gone down. The other thing I suppose to highlight is the potential issue with negative rates. And I mentioned this at my last update, and this has actually occurred now. The Debt Management Office or central government has briefly and for certain periods of deposits started charging you money to give them money. We've so far not ended up having to take them up on that slightly dubious offer. But if Bank of England base rates were to drop, or if that continues, it's quite likely we would end up having to take negative rate investments to maintain our liquidity and security. But of course, that would be mentioned and you'd see it in our interest returns. To hedge against that somewhat, we've taken out a number, I think 3 longer 1 to 2 year fixed rate return investments over the last couple of months that assure somewhere in the region of 60 to 70% of our forecast income for the next 2 years of the medium-term financial plan, which puts us in a good place in achieving those targets, although the remaining 30 to 40% may prove a challenge depending on where the markets go. And I've mentioned it earlier, but I should absolutely bring to the attention of the committee that we have in fact breached the interest risk rate indicator 10, which is currently at £1 million. And this is again because we've needed a higher level of liquidity to meet our expenditure needs recently, and we have asked for this to be increased going forward so that we're not highlighting it in normal operation. And I think that's it. Are there any questions from the committee?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for holding me back from moving on. I don't see any hands raised. Okay, thank you very much, and for the clarity in which you introduce it. So now we go on to item 9, which is the work programme for the committee. And if we look at, particularly looking ahead for the next financial or the next year, not the financial year, but the next year, you'll see that the development sessions have now been highlighted in the work programme by meeting, and there is one in there for the trading companies. Does anybody have any comments on the work programme or the detail of it or the scope? David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Just following Suresh's presentation earlier on, when he said that the reporting date is likely to be the end of September, we've got annual financial report and the external audit final results scheduled in for the 30th of July meeting. I just wonder whether that's now realistic and whether we should be looking at pushing that back to the 24th of September meeting.
Yeah, I think if we, are we content with that, officers? Does that meet that might be a relic from last year. John?
Yes, absolutely. If if once we get confirmation that that has changed, then that seems very sensible.
Thank you. Mike Davey.
Thank you, Chair. It was just going back to the discussion we had with Kim earlier. I was trying to work out where the governance arrangements bit would come in. Well, is that next time? Would that fit within the new meeting on assurance? I suppose I look for steerage from Robert or Kim. Yeah, Kim's nodding, so I think the answer is yes.
Yes, it would come with the assurance framework.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you.
Okay. Any other? No, yes, Mike's gone. No other hands up. This is an evolving list, but it is important that, just like Mike Davey has raised and David Brown, that we keep an eye on it and try and get them in the right sequencing for the year. Okay, that brings us on to the final item, which is the date of the next meeting. And if you look in the agenda, you'll see that the dates for the future year have also been put down. So our next meeting is on the 5th of March. And then the last meeting for this cycle is the 6th of April. And then we move on to the next civic year. I think we will, maybe when we do our annual report, we will need to consider the number of meetings and are they appropriate? Because when we started off 4 years ago, I think it was 4 in the calendar. I think this year we will have had 7 or 8 by the time it's done. We've had 2 extraordinary meetings. One was for the Constitution and the assurance framework coming up. I just asked members to, when they're thinking through the dates, if they have any views about the volume of work we're doing or the periodicity. We do need to think about that later, because I'm quite content as chair that we should respond to the volume of business, but I just ask you to think about whether we have the detail of how often we see various things is appropriate. So could I leave it with that to think about? And when we get to the annual report, which will be Mayish time, I'd like us to take a view that we're content with the rhythm. And if not, we might need to do something about it. We have a reserve date in the next cycle, and equally the dates that are firm we can review if things change. But otherwise, could you please put them in the diary for now? I don't know if there's anybody got any comments on that at this stage. No. All right. Well, thank you very much for officers and our auditors for taking us through the agenda and for all the contributions from members. And we can now call this at 11:32. We are finished. And those of us who have injections can now run away and be injected. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.